Good afternoon. Hi. I'm Rachel Clark. I am one of the pastors here at New Monmouth, and we just, as a congregation, as the pastors, want to welcome you here. We're so glad and so thrilled to have Karen Swallow Pryor with us to share some of her wisdom and her learning with us, to challenge us, to hear from, just to hear what she has to say about the evangelical imagination. I was trying to think back to when I was first exposed to Karen's work, and I couldn't remember, or my children interrupted me, and I didn't get to remember. But it's been a while, and I've just always been just amazed by her way of communicating, and just find it so helpful. And when people would ask me, about who she is as an author, one of my favorite things to say, I don't know if favorite is the right word, but to explain who she is I'm like, there's a lot of people who are really conservative who think she's too progressive, and then there's a lot of progressive people who think she's too conservative. She finds herself often in the middle, and but engages with people that disagree with her so well, and I really appreciate that. In the beginning of her new book, she talks about what the purpose of the book is, which is always helpful if you are, a student especially. You want to know, okay, what am I supposed to be learning from this? She says, the goal of this book is to help tease out the elements of the evangelical social imaginary in such a way that those elements that are truly Christian can be better distinguished from those that are merely cultural. And I think this is such a good definition of what we do so often as a church. That is a good definition of what the reformers were doing back in 1517. Is that the right date? Somebody correct me, come on. Super Reformation person. That we need to question some of that water that we're swimming in to know, is this being true to the gospel of Jesus Christ, and hold on to those parts of our traditions that are meaningful and good and do line up with our confession, but also to be willing to let some of our traditions, our thoughts, our cultural practices be challenged. So with that in mind, we are just excited to hear from you, Karen. She's going to present to us, and then there will be time for questions. So if you're a person who needs to think about your questions, jot something down as you're sitting there, and there will be an opportunity for that. So Karen Swallow Pryor.
I have to turn this on. Hello? You can hear me? All right, great. So yes, I'm going to talk about the evangelical imagination, and don't worry, I will define the terms, so bear with me. A lot of terms that need to be defined. So first I'm just going to talk about imagination. When I was working on this book, and when you publish a book and you're in the process of writing it, you have a working title, and so you sometimes use the working title. It doesn't always end up being the exact title, but in this case, this is the final title, and it was my working title. But a lot of times when I would talk about writing this book and tell people I was writing about the evangelical imagination, they would say something like, "Oh, you're going to write about Tolkien and Lewis?" And I'm like, no, they are mentioned in here. But that just points out to me just how limited the contemporary American evangelical imagination is. We have a couple people that we think of as being imaginative, and they are imaginative, but there are a bunch of others too. See, I'm already probably stepping on toes, sorry. I always do. So I do address what the imagination is in the book, but I'm talking about something else that I'll get to in a minute. But I do want to talk about the imagination, because I think that, and again, I'm an evangelical. I think I'm somewhat conservative, but other people tell me otherwise, so who knows? The categories don't hold anymore. But I think it's safe to say that, as 21st century Americans, as 21st century American Christians, As Reformed Christians in particular, I would say, even going back to 1517, and as moderns, we are just not as pro-imagination as perhaps we should be. We live in an era, modernity itself, the last 500 years, is one that emphasizes reason over imagination in general. So then you might find pockets of people who, overcorrect by focusing more on the imagination and rejecting reason, or emphasizing it less. And so I just think that we live in a moment, or at least I live in a moment and a time where we have an impoverished view of the imagination in general. So I want to just reclaim that a little bit. And there's so much that we could say about the imagination that anyone could, and there are books about it. But just to sort of bring it down to its bare essentials, the fact that we are made as human beings in God's image is an example of the imagination. I mean, they're the same word, image. The word imagination comes from image. We are the products of God's imagination. He imagined us, imaged us. We are the products of his imagination. And being made in his image, being made in his likeness, means many things. But one of the things that it means is that we also can be like him in having imaginations and using our imagination. So this alone is something I think it's worth just stopping, pausing, and thinking about. We won't do that for too long because I've got a lot to get through here. But, just to think about being as human beings made in God's image, that says something about the worth, importance, value, and godliness of having an imagination. And then if we just, step away from that more theological point and think about it in a very basic philosophical way or an anthropological way, what does imagination mean? In its most literal sense, it refers to our ability to make an image in our mind, just to imagine something. That's pretty profound. In itself also, and that, again, that is what the word means. It's like the ability to make an image, to imagination, the process of that. I'm an animal lover. I love dogs. I think my dogs have a lot of personality, a lot of emotions, all those things, but I don't really think that they imagine the way we do as human beings. I think my dog Ruby does imagine cookies a lot. She can just, like treats, we call them cookies, but I still, but that's more of an instinctive level. She asks for them all day long. So maybe there's some sort of imagination going on there, but it's simply not the same thing as what we can do as a human being when we think about, a conversation that we might have tomorrow, or what the drive home today might look like, or remember the drive, that we took and saw all the leaves. I mean, that's just a function that is very unique to human beings. So while we might often think of imagination as something that only some people have, or it's very creative, or really like woo-hoo out there, imagination is just something that is part of what we do all day long, as we think, as we picture, as we predict, even as we worry. I mean, most of our worries are imaginary. I tell myself. I need to remind myself. Some of them are very rooted in reality, but they're still using our imaginations to think about the things that worry us and give us anxiety. So again, imagination is a reflection of being made in God's image. Imagination is something that we do as human beings, just in forming pictures, forming memories, thinking about things that will happen, that have happened, going over in our conversation when we're lying in our minds a conversation that we had earlier. It's 2:00 in the morning and we can't stop thinking about it, right? That's using our imagination. If we think about it a little bit more as we're accustomed to thinking about it in terms of creativity and art versus life, if we go take a quick jaunt through history and think about how philosophers have thought about imagination, there are sort of two main categories, and that the metaphors we can use for those are mirror and lamp. Like, we can use our imagination to reflect what we see in the world around us. That's captured in the expression of art imitating life. So a painter paints what he sees in front of him. A sculptor sculpts something that he sees in front of him, or then adds some imaginary aspects to it. But it's reflecting something about reality. But we can also think of imagination, and some philosophers have, as being more not a mirror so much as a lamp. It's like shining light on some aspect of the world, or something that we want to be true, where we want the world to look like. So these metaphors of imagination as a mirror or as a lamp are ones that, if you study a little bit of the philosophy behind it, you'll encounter, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, which I won't get into here. But I think in a better understanding of imagination that philosophers and other thinkers have come to now is there's more of an emphasis on the interplay between these things. It's not just that we see something and recreate it in our mind, or we fantasize about something that doesn't even exist. It really, what comes in between those two things is perception. And so if you think about what perception is, if you think of it just as our eyes or our ears or our sense of touch, that's where imagination begins, with our bodily sensory experience. And so if you think of it that way, and then our bodies translate that into something else. We see it, we hear it, we feel it, and then our mind works on it, and so we imagine something about it. Now, there's a lot of aesthetic theory and philosophy about this, but if you think about something like if something is just out of focus that you're looking at, and then it comes into focus, you make some sense out of it. And that's not anything that happened to the thing. It's something that happened between your eyes and your mind making sense of it. Or you think of those, I don't know if any of you lived through this, but what were they called? The things you look at, the mind, thank you, magic eye, yes, you're tracking with me. It's just it looks like a blob, but if you focus your eyes in just the right way, the picture emerges. This is an 80s thing. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's fine. But it's just an example of how our bodily perception has to kind of map up with something that the image that our mind is making. So perception is very important. If we don't perceive something, if we don't see it, it's not going to play a part in our imagination. And then suddenly, if we do see it, all of a sudden it becomes important in what we're thinking about. There's actually so the whole riddle or the saying about if a tree falls in a forest, what is it? If a tree falls in a forest and no one, see, I don't even. Yeah. Like that I can't even, that blows my mind. I don't even know what the answer to that is. Does it make a sound? Right. But this one makes a little more sense to me. This comes from Owen Barfield, someone who writes a lot, who is actually a great influence on C.S. Lewis, and he writes about these things. He says, there's no such thing as an unseen rainbow. Now, I'm not a scientist or a meteorologist, so I can't explain anything, but I think we all know that the rainbow is the way the water is in the sky and the sun shining through, and the way our eyes see it. It's actually a perceptive phenomenon. So in order for it to exist, we have to see it. And so this is an example, I think, that just sort of illuminates how powerful the imagination is, and how connected to imagination is our own perception. And even before, in between perception and imagination, is attention, is paying attention. And there's a little poem that I like to share to explain this. It's one of my favorite poems to teach. It's by William Carlos Williams, and it's very short. The poem is, "So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow. glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. That's the poem. I love teaching that to freshman business majors. They're like, this is poetry? But the whole point of the poem, with all of its, the rainwater, the glazing, the chickens, the redness, all of it, the whole poem is about perception and attention and how much depends on what we actually pay attention to. How many times do we drive down the road the same way every day and go past the same thing every day and never pay any attention to it until something just draws our attention to it and we realize we have not seen this thing that we've seen every day. And the fact is that William Carlos Williams, who was an early 20th century poet, was actually, his day job was being a doctor, a country doctor who made house calls. And he composed that poem when he was sitting at the bedside of a small boy who was dying. And he was sitting at the bed by the boy, tending to him, and looked out the window and saw the red wheelbarrow and just realized how much life depends on ordinary things. And so it's perceiving, it's paying attention, and then imagining the meaning of something. That's what imagination is. But that's actually not even what my book is about. So, although I do cover some of that, or all of that. What my book is really about is a more philosophical term that's rooted in the word imagination, but is a little bit more removed from it. And the term that is the basis of my book is the social imaginary. I was talking with Eric, whom I just met today, who said I'm the first person that he's known who's used the word imaginary as a noun. We usually use imaginary as an adjective. We'll say, oh, my imaginary friend. But an imaginary is a word that philosophers have used, and I draw particularly on Charles Taylor. It's talking about a sort of pool. A social imaginary is a pool, a collective pool of inherited or traditional stories, images, myths, legends, ideas, expectations, visions for the good life. They're things that we carry around not just in our own individual imaginations, but in our social communities. Just sort of expectations about how things should go. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One is just, you can go to different cultures around the world, different places around the world, and you'll see that people line up differently. Nobody tells you, right? Nobody tells you, that you're supposed to, stand in line single or just, all come up to the counter in a queue. Like, those aren't written down rules, but if you go someplace where they do it differently, you're really thrown for a loop because there's just sort of an inherited, customary expectation of how things should go. That's sort of a trivial example. I'll give you one that's probably a little bit of a stronger one. That is the American dream. Something that affects us all, that has informed us all, has shaped our worlds and shaped our lives in ways that we may not even recognize. Now, there are different ways we might define something like the American dream. I think sort of the basic definition since America has existed has been the idea that, wherever you start in life, you can create something and build something so that your children will have a better life than you. So wherever you start, you're going to build something, and your children will be more successful than you are. And often that has in the past taken the form of, the stereotypical, little house with a white picket fence and 2.3 kids, or I guess now it's like 1.7 or whatever. And so, so that's an image that we have for the American dream. Now, we might not think about the American dream a lot. We might not talk about it a lot. Yet it still is out there in such a powerful way that is actually, I think, what's driving a lot of the serious problems we're facing right now. For example, the student debt crisis. A lot of young people have gone to college and paid much more than they could have or should have without questioning it, because everyone just kind of was like, oh, this is what you're supposed to do. And nobody did the math. Well, I didn't. I don't. So I'm not casting aspersions, but I'm just saying, it's just sort of an unspoken assumption that if you want to be successful, this is what you do, without looking at all of the factors. And so now we've reached a place in our economy where the students who've done that can't pay off these loans, and so we're all arguing and debating about it, and also have a lot of bad attitudes out there about the young people who aren't getting married and having children and buying homes. Well, they can't because the economic situation is such that they're trying to pay off their loans. Now, I'm obviously very much glossing over a lot of details about this, but it's just an example of how something can be so powerful in a social imaginary that affects the entire economy and affects lives and affects our own expectations, or even the young people's disappointment that somehow they haven't lived up to an expectation that they don't know how to or can't, when 200 years ago nobody had that expectation. Right now in other places no one has that expectation. It's part of the social imaginary. There's a quote, actually Rachel alluded to this. It's a famous quote by David Foster Wallace that he gave in a commencement speech a number of years ago, where he illustrates this idea by telling the story of two goldfish who are in a goldfish bowl swimming along. An older fish swims by them and says to the two younger fish, "How's the water?" And one of the younger fish looks at his buddy and says, "What the hell is water?" Pardon, that's how the story goes. But that's the point, is that we don't even know that we're swimming in these expectations and stories, because it's just part of our social imaginary. So, we are part of different communities, different traditions, so there are lots of different social imaginaries. There's not just one. But if you are an evangelical, as I am, or even if you're not an evangelical, you are affected by a long-standing evangelical social imaginary. Now, it's filled with many images, ideas, metaphors, and so forth, as they all are, and they can't all be accounted for. In fact, the definition that I draw on by Charles Taylor, part of his definition is that these are precognitive, like they're subconscious. They aren't things that we necessarily think about until, I stand up here and we say, oh, let's think about the American dream. But they're there under the surface. And because they're precognitive and we don't necessarily think about them unless we try to or we're asked to, a social imaginary contrasts sharply with a different idea that's closely related, and that's biblical or Christian worldview, which a lot of the Reformed tradition and Reformers are big on that. I've been pretty big on that because I like thinking. And biblical worldview is just taking biblical principles and applying them to issues or ideas or politics or whatever it might be. It's a very cognitive, rational thing to do, to say, oh, what does the Bible teach about this? Well, how does that apply to this idea? And it's something that I used a lot in teaching my classes over the decades, even teaching literature. I'd say, well, how can we think about this work of literature with a biblical worldview? That's something that I've spent a lot of my life doing. But I started reading a Christian philosopher named James K.A. Smith, if any of you are familiar with him. He's written a number of books laying out what he calls a liturgical anthropology, in which he talks about how, to sum up sort of what he says in his own words, he says, following Augustine, that human beings are desiring creatures before we are thinking creatures. We are driven more by what we desire than what we cognitively or rationally think. So let's think about that for a minute. You know, you don't have to be a psychologist to sort of understand this, to think, you know, if we, you know, we have, you know, this is being recorded, right? It won't go out there, yeah. I mean, we've just had a family interaction recently and saw some family members we hadn't seen in a long time, and we're just talking about sort of the unhappiness of one family member, and, you know, and my husband said, you know, well, you know, she just wants to be loved, right? I mean, that's a basic human thing, and sometimes we are driven by those deepest needs and desires in us. That might be one, or we want to be accepted, or we want family. And so we may not even realize that we have these desires that are driving us and guiding even our rational behaviors more than we realize. And part of what Jamie Smith says is that our desires actually can be cultivated, rightly or wrongly, badly or well, by our practices and habits. So the things that we do over and over can cultivate in us desires, rituals, liturgies, like the literal kind, but also he talks about, I mean, his work goes back a couple decades now, so he talks about like the American shopping mall as being sort of like an experience that develops, you walk through it, you look at what's there, and you develop desires for what's in front of you. And so there are lots of ways that our practices, habits, and rituals can cultivate desires in us, and therefore create the kinds of desires, that drive our cognitive, rational thinking. And so I'm trying to deal with some of those in those sort of inherited assumptions and expectations within evangelicalism in the book. And so, of course, I do need to sort of define evangelical for the sake of the conversation, and I do that. Right now, you know, in the past few years, a lot of people have contested the term and said, you know, what is an evangelical, or who is an evangelical? There are books by these titles. Am I evangelical? Still evangelical? I contributed to that book. Ex-evangelical, that's a hashtag on Twitter. I mean, everyone's talking about evangelicals. Whether someone is one, isn't one, they are one, they aren't one anymore, they used to be one, they never were one. I mean, it's just a huge debate right now. But there is actually sort of an academic definition of evangelical that goes back to the Evangelical Revival, which is its beginnings in the 18th century in England and the Great Awakenings in America in the 18th century. I mean, obviously, the Reformation uses that word, Luther used that word, but when we're talking about the evangelical movement, that is something that has existed for 300 years and grew directly out of the context in Great Britain, where there was a state church, and so there was sort of a default assumption, speaking of social imaginary, that one was a Christian if one was born as a citizen of that nation, and you would just be confirmed or not if you were in some sort of, you know, marginal group. And so out of that context arose this new emphasis on the idea of conversion. Like, wait, you know, you're not a Christian just because you're born into a Christian country or born to a Christian family. You do have to be converted. And so conversionism is one of the 4 characteristics that the church historian David Bebbington famously defines as defining the evangelical movement. The emphasis on conversion, which I'll talk about more in a minute. Then the emphasis on the Bible as like authoritative for the believer's life, and then an emphasis on salvation through Christ's crucifixion specifically, and an emphasis on activism, social change, reform, and those 4 qualities existed from the beginning of evangelicalism in the 18th century, and I would argue are still sort of the main defining features today. That's called the Bebbington Quadrilateral for any nerds out there. But so that's the movement. That's how it's been defined. It can be contested and is being contested now. Now the word is being used a lot by pollsters and sociologists and historians and politicians in ways that don't necessarily line up with those definitions. But a lot of people use the term as a self-definition without necessarily knowing the history. So yes, it is somewhat problematic, but it is a term that's 300 years old and carries with it all of that. And so where I get to the role of the social imaginary is that the evangelical movement in 18th century England and also in America was so powerful in the 18th century and so influential that it brought about a number of things. In England in particular, it helped bring about the end of the slave trade. The early evangelicals were abolitionists and social reformers. They established Sunday schools. They were the first, William Wilberforce, who headed up the campaign to abolish slavery in Parliament, also helped to found the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the first humane society. A lot of people don't know that. I mean, these people were activists and they wanted to change the world for the better for all of God's creatures. And so that activist spirit is strong for good, but also for some not so good as well. And so that evangelical influence helped to bring about the rise of the British Empire in the 19th century and Victorian culture, which is fascinating and interesting. And the best way I can sum up the Victorian age is not with my words, but those of Charles Dickens. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times, right? So we see, for example, in the Victorian age, just to give you sort of one example that illustrates the complexity, we see, because of the influence of evangelicals and biblical Christianity, also at a time when the Industrial Revolution was taking place, an emphasis on marriage and family and domesticity, which are wonderful things. But along with that came an emphasis on the purity of the woman and the placement of her on a pedestal to be the angel in the house. And so at the same time that there was this emphasis on family and domesticity and all the family values that the term we might use today, prostitution in London was at a record rate. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So there's this sort of great thing going on, but there was a dirty underbelly underneath that went along with it. And so those are the kinds of things we can look at and say, what is going on here that's underneath the surface? And so because I teach a lot of Victorian literature, and specifically in an evangelical context, I would hear from students who would read this literature, and there's a lot of literature on what was called then the woman question, and on the purity question, the angel question, literature that would either reflect or question beliefs about women in particular, that if they did not remain pure, they would be ruined, and the whole society would be ruined, and the women were supposed to be the guardians of male morality. And my students would say things like, "This sounds like how I was raised." Or they would come to my office and say, "I was raped, and I have been believed ever since then that I am impure, and I am ruined, and I am dirty, and I can't be fixed." And what they were saying is that they were taught the same things that we were reading about in Victorian literature. So I started to have these conversations with them and ask them, okay, so what about this idea or this principle is truly rooted in the Bible? What is really biblical here? And what's just Victorian? And so we started to have these conversations, and that's when I was reading James K.A. Smith and thinking about how our desires drive us more often than our rational arguments, and how the imagination plays such an important role, and how, literature, if there's like a popular poem that I talk about in the book is called Angel in the House, and it puts the woman on this pedestal, and how if that's so popular and that casts a kind of imagination about the roles of women and the roles of men, that can become more solidified in our thinking, even as Christians, than what the Bible teaches. And we have to separate those things out. And so that was kind of the beginning of the book. And over those years, I think we're all seeing it. We're seeing a lot of young people who are raised in evangelical subculture, either abandoning the faith or leaving the church, or undergoing what many call deconstruction, which sometimes can result in them, no longer being believers. But more and more often I'm seeing is really just disentangling these cultural principles and norms and teachings from the actual biblical ones. And that's a process that I think we all need to support and get behind, because we are essentially, and I talk about this, I think, somewhere in the book on Reformation. During the Reformation, when there were so many abuses in the church and so much corruption, and there was a counter-reformation for any Catholic friends out there, yes, but there were so many abuses and corruption in the church that this all needed, a similar kind of disentanglement needed to take place. And at the same time, the Reformation wouldn't have happened, I don't think, if there hadn't been the invention of something called the printing press that could circulate not only teachings, Reformation teachings, but also circulate the Bible itself, and people could read it for themselves. Well, now 500 years later, we are living in a digital age where there is also a similar removal of all the gatekeepers so that people can communicate with one another. But that also means misinformation and disinformation can be spread, and the same thing happened with printed materials. Heresy could spread as easily as right teaching. So it was chaotic and confusing, and people were burned at the stake, let me remind you. So it was really a very difficult time. And I don't know what it felt like to live then, because I didn't. But I'm beginning to feel like I know what it was like, because this is also a chaotic time, and people are confused, and they are, some are abandoning the faith, but some are finding a truer, more biblical faith. And there is, in case you don't know, a lot of corruption and abuse in our institutions. Probably to the level of some of them that existed in the pre-Reformation days, I would venture to say. And so I think this is an important task, to think not just about, what our doctrine teaches and what our official documents say, but also the sort of stories and images and ideas that are beneath the surface, that are driving us and forming us in ways that we might not even think about. And, I mentioned conversion as one example, and I'll sort of flesh this one out. There's like so much more that I could say, and I want to make sure I have a lot of time for questions and answers. But, I'm an evangelical. I'm also Baptist, so I really believe in conversion. I believe in, you have to be saved, and you need to be born again, and whatever term you want to put on it. I think it's really important that was re-emphasized. Each individual soul is accountable before God and will stand before God. I believe all of that. And yet at the same time, I can also look at history and say, when you really emphasize conversion, something good, to the point that it becomes distorted and excessive, so that, say, what becomes really important is how many hands were raised, how many people came forward, how many people filled out the card, how many people, that you can write, numbers you can fill in for your newsletter home to raise more funds. When those things become more important than actual conversion or salvation, and also not just conversion, but discipleship and sanctification, then if you don't emphasize those things, and all you emphasize, and I'm speaking in sweeping terms here, but if you emphasize the number of hands raised and the number of people who come forward at the expense of the formation and the discipleship, then guess what you end up with? And I won't point at anything specific, but you can fill in the blank for yourself with what we have ended up with today in terms of people who perhaps identify as Christians, and maybe they are going to go to heaven, maybe they will be there, but there is little or no fruit, or there is corruption, and so forth. So we can take something good, like conversion, and when that becomes a prevailing metaphor or image or idea in our minds to the point that we don't have a counterbalancing understanding of what happens after that, then a virtue can become a vice. And then we can also, and this is sort of goes along with conversion, is testimony, the stories of our conversion. We can overemphasize that necessity, which is not a necessity, but the feeling that there's a necessity to know the day, the time, and the hour when you said that sinner's prayer, or having a very dramatic conversion where you were a terrible, terrible sinner, and then you were saved, that's wonderful. But what about the little child who is saved before having the opportunity to do those horrible things and lives a good, long, faithful life, undramatic? Isn't that the most dramatic testimony? But we can, because we are human, and because we like the flashy, and we like the before and after, and because we emphasize conversion so much, that can mean that we have a false or distorted sense of what it means to be converted and to have that wonderful story that we tell, or that testimony. So these are just two examples of sort of the important ingredients, central ingredients of the evangelical social imaginary, and ones that that have a good history and have good reason for existing, but also we need to think about, are they driving our desires and practices and habits in ways that can have unintended consequences and are based in unexamined assumptions. Yeah, there are so many other things that I wanted to cover. Let me just cover one more thing before I open up to Q&A. And that is, I mentioned before that evangelicalism had a very influential role in the Victorian age and the rise of the British Empire. And that's important because during the 19th century, I wasn't really much of a history student. I didn't like history, but by studying literature, I had to learn history, and then I liked it. But they say of the British, of the Victorian age, that was the age when the sun never set on the British Empire. Well, newsflash, it did. And the sun could set on any empire that exists, and has, and probably will. It's documented measurably that Great Britain ruled literally 1/4 of the globe at that time through colonialism. And that was also a time when we can see that activist spirit of evangelicalism that I talked about before, which manifested in the missions movement. Missionaries went around the world and took the gospel to other places in the world. And that is a good and important thing. But there are a couple of things that have been left out of that story or need to be considered, and that is that the missions, the justification of sharing the gospel was used to commit atrocities on native peoples around the world. It was justified to do these things, to colonize people and to overtake their lands and their goods, and done in the name of the gospel. And we don't probably do that anymore, at least not in a literal way, But there are ways that we can still sort of exhibit that, what's called the white savior complex, as we evangelize or do missions work, or even just simply try to bring about some sort of social reforms. I know I have that. Like, that's my personality. I want to save the world. But there are ways we can save the world by empowering people, or there are ways we can save the world by making ourselves the heroes of the story. And this metaphor of empire does the latter. And we can see it so much through a lot of the Victorian works of literature that I teach and we study, that if maybe you've read in the past, and if you go back and revisit them today with different eyes, you see them differently. So Robinson Crusoe is another one, a great story of adventure and this heroic guy who survives on an island for 23 years through the strength of his hands and the ingenuity of his mind. And then he meets his man Friday, and Friday converts and becomes a Christian, all that great story. But it's very clear when you read the story, depending on the version, because it was edited a number of times, but that Friday is a slave, and that Robinson Crusoe ended up on that island because he was on a slave expedition. And he became rich at the end because of the slaves that he still owned. But that part of the story is sort of like hidden underneath the surface and isn't part of our the way that we imagine it. And so when we start to see how power and empire underlies so much of what we think is good about, the American dream, the American enterprise, all of these things, we can better understand that we've left something out, and that we also may be driven by these desires and images and metaphors that more so than the rational thinking, where we would just say, no, that is wrong. And we don't believe that anymore, and yet there are elements of it lurking underneath. And so I think, again, in my world, which is filled with big conferences and mega churches and the things that my friend Skye Jethani called about 10 years ago, he coined the term evangelical industrial complex. There's actually a spirit of kind of empire underneath all of that. It just takes a different form. But it's still, I think, based on the same kind of metaphor or image. And so once you start to see those things, then you start to see everything differently. And one of the things that I closed that chapter on the book with, which I would encourage you to do, is the Johnny Cash rendition of a Nine Inch Nails song called "Hurt," and it's a song where the way that Johnny Cash sings it, he talks about there's a video that accompanies it that he's looking, he's singing this just before his death. Actually, it turns out he didn't know, but he's looking at all of his accomplishments that he's made over his life and his family and things that have succeeded and things that have failed, and he calls it all an empire of dirt, and he says that you could have it all if he could just find a way. And he was a Christian. He was actually baptized and converted. And I think that he's seeing how much the works of man are meaningless apart from something much greater and more lasting than ourselves. And of course, we know that is Jesus, and I believe that Cash did too, and that in his way in this song, he is pointing us to that way, which we cannot find unless we are willing to give up our empire of dirt, as he puts it, or to give up our lives so that we may find it. So anyway, I would love to have some dialogue and discussion about all of this. I know it was a lot.
Maybe you're mostly Presbyterian. Probably in our, obviously you've thought of this topic a lot. What would you say, because I think county conversions and empires are, here we're this lovely small congregation, as we have them up and down the valley, are probably not as much characteristic of the evangelical imagination for Presbyterians. Do you have any specific examples that might be applicable to us?
Yes.
Don't tell Casey I said that.
Yeah, so I think the question, just to repeat it, make sure I got it right, is do I have anything sort of like from the Presbyterian social imaginary that I could point out? Well, not being a Presbyterian, I guess, I mean, I would say that maybe it is more of the, the emphasis on reason and order, which are good, but also maybe don't leave as much room for like the spirit or aesthetic experience. And again, if it's just an underlying assumption, you don't realize that you're kind of erring in that direction and leaving out the other. Does that make sense? Yeah. I do talk in the book briefly about. I think I've written so many things now about hierarchy. Like so a hierarchical worldview has great benefits to it, but it also has some negatives. So that would be another thing. Whereas Baptists and Congregationalists are all about sort of small d democracy, which has its own advantages, but also if you read any headlines. Has the great disadvantage of saying, oh, nobody's in charge, so nobody's accountable. So those are things that I think just sort of interrogating the strengths and weaknesses of our even our organizational metaphors. Great question.
As you were speaking about empowerment, it feels like Jesus was always empowering, especially females in the Bible. And when I think about empowerment, I think about the saying, if you give a man a fish, he can eat for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he can eat for a lifetime. And I know Heifer Project is one of those organizations that does missions all over, and that is their philosophy. In the area where I live, we had a relative that passed away recently. And in his obituary, he said he didn't say this, but they wrote it about him, obviously. But they said the most important thing that he had ever done in his entire life was during World War I, when he helped distribute cows to families in Europe. And I think missions can be so many things.
No, I'm familiar with Heifer International, right? That makes sense that is their sort of motto. I'll give up another example. This is a really dramatic example, but it's local. So, is this part being recorded? Okay, no, it's fine. I just, it's very complicated, and and I realize there are many sides, but there's actually right now, I think it's on one of the 8 channels I don't get, HBO. There's a mini series on, but previously there was also a podcast that I'm listening to, and it involves a Central Virginia woman who went to Uganda as a 19-year-old. And started out just bringing food to starving children who were dying of malnutrition. That's how she started out. And then she ended up, by the time she was 22, she was running a medical clinic with no training, no college, no training, and hundreds of children died under her care. She was being called a doctor, and people thought she was a doctor, and some of it might have been a language barrier. But she was 22 years old and trying to administer medicine to dying children, and a lot of them died. And so that's an example of not empowering. Her story, from what I understand, is also very complicated too, in the sense of sort of getting into this over her head, not on purpose, but also what role did her social imaginary play in helping her think she could or should do this, and getting so far along before being faced with the reality of what she was doing. That's like the opposite of teaching people to fish.
I know you're very steeped in evangelical culture and understand it really well. So I imagine a lot of the elements of the social imaginary as you were looking at it, you're able to kind of make a lot of these connections historically pretty easily, and they that connection to Victorian, sexual ethics, and that sort of thing, to purity culture. I'm wondering, as you were doing the research and thinking for this book, what were the most sort of surprising or counterintuitive sources of the evangelical social imaginary that you found, that you thought, I didn't even realize that this is where this might have come from in the evangelical social imaginary?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say I would give two answers to that. I did a chapter on domesticity, which I mentioned, because how could I talk about this without talking about men and women and masculine and feminine? But everyone's writing about that, so I didn't want to write about that. So I just wanted to write about the domestic realm. And I learned a lot. I mean, some of this I already knew, it's my specialty, but as I was revising the chapter, I realized that, I kind of started out, I wanted to be like, oh, women aren't supposed to be the angel in the house, and, which, I don't think they are. But then I was coming down more on sort of the negative side of what evangelicalism contributed to domesticity, but then I realized, no, I love being home, and I love, my opening line in that chapter is a man's home is his castle, and I talk about the origins of that, that was actually originally said when people had when sovereigns lost the right to just randomly enter someone's private home. It was a private property law. And so I kind of brought myself around. I said, no, I don't want to not say a man's home is his castle, because I believe that. But what I want to say is that a woman's home is her castle too. But it took me a long time to kind of come around to that through the process of writing and research. And I believe and say in the book that I think evangelicalism made that happen. It actually gave women agency, and individual agency and moral agency, such that we have more than we did before they came along. And I would just say the Empire chapter was probably the most revealing for me. I knew I was going to talk about Robinson Crusoe and Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden. But when I was making connections with empire and modern day entrepreneurialism within evangelicalism, that's when some dots started to connect for me. So that was a little surprising, yeah.
Hi. I work with a lot of college students, and so I think I have two very practical questions about, how do you have some practical advice for how would you encourage somebody to exercise sort of that muscle of the social imaginary, particularly if they are not, say, avid readers or able to attend academic lectures or something like that. But also I'm curious too about the role of cynicism too, and particularly how you would guard against that, or if you have any practical advice about that.
Okay. So I don't think you have to be read all the Victorian literature to think about, even though I like to, but think about social imaginary. One thing I didn't get to in my talk that I do cover a little bit in the book is the fact that all language is metaphorical. And I've had a lot of people who've read the book who that's the thing that really resonated with them the most, where they can, after reading, they can look around and say, oh, I'm really noticing all of the metaphors, right? And so if we pay attention, I mean, some metaphors that we use are biblical, so we're not going to throw them out. Like born again is a biblical metaphor. So even though that's become sort of, politically incorrect or passé or whatever, maybe Presbyterians don't like that. No, I don't, I'm just kidding. You must be born again. But it's in the Bible, and so we can think about its strength, but the Bible uses other language, so it doesn't have to be just that term. So there's that category of words, but there's so many other ways that we have Christianese or evangelicalese, that actually is, some metaphors can be fresh and good, but some of them we need to think about what are they saying. So purity culture is laden with those, right? And I've had people bring that up to me, like if they grew up being told that if they had slipped up sexually once before marriage, they were like a piece of chewed gum. Like, I mean, what a horrible metaphor to think of yourself as. And that's a very damaging metaphor. And so I think if we, even just at the level of language, and when people, we're going to use language. So that means we're going to use metaphors. But to think about what metaphors we use, what language we use to describe our experience, and how illuminating it can be, or maybe how limiting it can be. And so even an example that I came across in the process of, it's not in the book, but I was in the book club I had about it, was came across a meme where someone said, you can't translate a meme well, but the point was that life is, we could say life is one step forward and one step back, or we could just call it the cha-cha, right? And I thought, as Christians, we often use the term backsliding, which is very negative. What if we actually expected that the Christian walk is going to always be one step forward, one step back, because that's just how life is, and then we called it the cha-cha instead of backsliding. Just little things like that. I think language is like at the core of our own understanding of ourselves and therefore our faith, and maybe the doubts that we have, like even the word deconstructing. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago with all the people who were getting very upset about the word deconstruction. They thought it was the most evil thing, and I thought, well, like really, if you're repairing a house, you've got to pick up the floor, whatever, I don't have the right words for it, but look under the floorboards, and you've got to get rid of the rotten parts before you can fix it. So what is, this is what we all should be doing. And so even a word like that can make a lot of people upset, or it can be very empowering. So I think paying attention to the language that people use can help unpack a lot that's in the social imaginary. And then the cynicism. I don't know if I have it. For me, I do think there is great value in talking about studying church history and just history. There are so many faithful saints who've gone before us and lived through such worse things that we've lived through, and their legacy is a gift to us today. And so that perspective, that wider perspective for me is just really what keeps me grounded. And it doesn't have to be like an academic textbook, but just like keeping our history, our tradition, the people who went before us always in front of us, I think helps us.
Would you be comfortable getting into the area of the relationship between religious empire and political empire? Because I see that as one of the biggest problems we have today. And if you're not,
yes,
that's okay.
No, I think there are things that we can objectively say about that. I spend too much time on social media, so I know things probably I wish that none of us would want to know, but literal Christian nationalism is becoming like a thing that people are debating. And so when some of those who are advocating for it, even a year ago would say, no, they're not, what they're arguing for is not Christian nationalism. And now they're saying, no, we want Christian nationalism. And so I do think that some of what we understand about American history and Christianity within America has fed into some false ideas about how, what America, what the relationship between politics and religion should be. and so, but at the same time, I mean, you know, things are changing fast, and people are afraid and desperate, and if we are Christians who believe that Christianity is, you know, the way, the truth, and the life, I mean, we do want to advocate for that. But I think, yeah, I don't know what, I think that the image and the notion in our history that's rooted in empire is a big part of how we often apply and understand those things. And so, yeah, I don't know if you want me to say more, but.
I was really impressed with the empire thing.
Okay, oh, thank you. That was like the hardest chapter to write, so thank you. Oh, and I'll just quote myself. I did say in there, I think it's better than anything I just said, is that the kingdom of heaven is not an empire.
So it's easy for those of us who are or have been going through some process of deconstruction to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater at times. Are there any pockets or thinkers or practices that you see in evangelicalism that are doing this well currently or have in the recent past that we can hang on to as we examine some of those floorboards underneath?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of the big gifts of the same gift that the internet is giving that the printing press gave long before. It's just giving us access to new ideas and new people, different ways of thinking, so that we can better see where our own communities maybe have gotten it wrong. And so you mean like specific writers or schools? Okay, yeah. I mean, well, I'll give you a couple of, like, so the Trinity Forum, full disclosure, I'm a fellow with the Trinity Forum, but the Trinity Forum curates excellent, like, literature. They publish excerpts of great works of literature with introductions for lay readers, but they host conversations online and feature the people who are writing these kinds of books that are very helpful, all from, by Christians. That would be my number one. And then, I think my publisher, Brazos, publishes a lot of, a great range of thinkers that cut across the categories. And I'm a book person, so I'm mainly going to recommend books, I guess. But they're out there. I'm actually very encouraged. I think that this sort of testing, trying, and sifting time that we're going through is it's exposing some ugly things that need to be exposed, but I think it's also letting some others sort of shine forth and see what we're really made of, I guess. And so just don't give in to cynicism. The Lord is doing this work, the Lord is doing this sifting and sorting and revealing. And it might be ugly and hard, but it's actually ultimately a mercy to see the truth rather than to continue to have it covered up.
Guess you gotta let the microphone close at hand. But anyway, I'd be interested in your thoughts on the role of the third person of the Trinity in forming our imagination and also countering, I guess, maybe some of these negative language that we would see within the evangelical imaginary. And I ask it in the context of how much the Enlightenment kind of informed the early evangelical movement and its focus on rationalism, and how much the downplay of the Holy Spirit played in forming a lot of this language.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I do think that anyone in the Protestant Reformed tradition, which I am, and the evangelicals are, probably has put less emphasis on the Holy Spirit over the past 500 years than in general than than we saw in, say, the book of Acts. So I always tell my students human history is a history of pendulum swings from one extreme to another, right? And hopefully whenever we see something that needs to be corrected, we correct without overcorrecting, but that's really almost impossible not to do. But if we're aware, then we can perhaps not overcorrect. And I mean, this is not my area, but this is just, verifiable, reported fact that Pentecostalism is the version of Christianity that's growing fastest worldwide. There must be a reason for that. There must be sort of a starvation for that. But I do think, just speaking as like a good Baptist, I think we have, and I wrote about this a few weeks ago, we have forgotten about the fruit of the Spirit. Like the fruit of the Spirit is what, if any kind of Christian is supposed to be bearing that fruit. And if we're not bearing that fruit in our own individual lives, in our congregations, in our communities, in our relationships, I'm not saying we're not Christians, but maybe we should go down the aisle again. No, I'm just kidding. So even that I see as being very neglected, even in some of the so-called thought leaders or grifters out there who are literally saying that this is not a time to be nice, this is not a time to be kind, there are people who are advocating for denial of the fruit of the Spirit in the name of some culture war or political victory. And that, again, is an opportunity for us to, we don't have to become Pentecostal to say, that's not biblical, that's not right. And so I think we ought to be paying more attention and striving to be more in tune to the Holy Spirit.
Maybe one more, if we've got time. Oh, back for more.
Yeah. I have a question just about going back to your idea about the pendulum swing. Where do you see the church as a whole moving, like the general trajectory of the church, as somebody who's been steeped in evangelicalism? Where do you see it going?
And now I do want to put a caveat. Almost everything I'm saying in the book and here today is very much like the American experience, or a la England. So I don't have a lot of knowledge or research in the area of the global church. So I will say where I think the American church is going. No, I'm not going to say that, but I could. No. I think we are entering, a post-institutional age. I think we are seeing the breakdowns of institutions. Higher ed is breaking down. Churches are breaking down. Big mega ministries are breaking down by their own misdoings. And so because it's through corruption and misdoings, and that's a good thing. I've always been an institutionalist my whole life. I actually believe in institutions and the power of institutions, but not these. And so I think that what we will see in the not too distant, and I don't know how far off future, is a return to like smaller, more organic communities and fellowship. And I think higher education as an institution, for example, will break down, but it will rebuild itself. I don't think I'll be alive to see it, but which is sad because I've devoted my whole life to it. But I think that we'll see a parallel kind of phenomenon in the churches. The big churches probably, institutions will continue to exist, but they'll exist for some other reasons, I think. And so there will be kind of a continued sifting and sorting and seeking for more organic community. That's my prediction.
It's a big one. We do want to close. No, it's okay if I pray for you and for this time. Karen's going to lead us in an altar call as well, and we almost had that, right? But everyone is invited to stick around for milk and cookies just down the hallway over there. What sort of cookies do we have?
There are peanut butter cookies.
Peanut butter cookies. Those include peanuts in them?
There are dark chocolate chunk cookies.
And there's a gluten-free one.
There's gluten-free oatmeal raisin.
There you go.
And
There you go. So thank you all for coming. I do want to just pray, but then stick around and take your time. So let's pray. Lord, we do thank you for times to gather with many churches of different backgrounds, to hear someone with great passion for what is going on and for what is being revealed. May the time that we've had in the hour or so be that beginning stage, eyes opening to see things perhaps in a new light, new things that have been going on, perhaps that have just been taken for granted, that we've driven by so many times, but help us to see by the work of your Spirit where you're calling us, where you're leading us, what we're being led from, what we're being led toward, so that we can seek the truth in you, to seek the truth in a graceful way, so that all that we do is in keeping with you, abiding in you, growing the fruit of your Spirit, so that people will see the gracious love and mercy that is at the heart of the Christian gospel. Continue to bless Karen in the ways that she goes out. May the passion and zeal that she has for this insight you've given to her be met with great clarity, that people will have the ears to hear, and so that your church can be blessed every time that she gets to come and share about the things that are on her heart. God, we thank you for this time and for the fellowship that we can have around milk and cookies. And pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you.